Welcome to Bebop Scales. Thank you for checking out lesson 2, which is why we use bebop scales and how to understand why we need to use them. So we're going to be talking about two of the most common bebop scales, which are the major 7th chord bebop scale and the dominant 7th chord bebop scale. It's important to note that the dominant 7th bebop scale is used both on the dominant chord, the 5 chord, and the corresponding 2 chord. And it's important to understand that we figure things out that we're talking about with bebop scales, not based on a theoretical point of view, but actually understanding what our heroes and the people that we're being influenced by in this music actually did. So bebop scales, if you're a piano player, bebop scales were played by Oscar Peterson and Bud Powell and Wynton Kelly and Red Garland and Horace Silver and Herbie Hancock. And if you're a trumpet player, they're played by Clifford Brown and Freddie Hubbard and Miles Davis and Lee Morgan and Kenny Dorham and Art Farmer. And if you're a saxophone player, they're played by Stan Getz and Hank Mobley and Sonny Rollins and Charlie Parker and Jackie McLean and John Coltrane. All these people play essentially 80 to 90% of their language is bebop scales. And it's a very, very flexible reality where you can sound a ton of different ways. When we study bebop scales, we focus on how to get into the sound of the chord that we're trying to play as specifically and as quickly as possible. And so we all kind of come up with the same formula that gets you to that result. But ultimately, when you understand how to do that, you use bebop scales to create the reality that you want to create melodically. So in my examples that are up here on my computer, the first thing I show is a C major scale descending. And the thing that's important to realize about this C major scale descending is that C, A, F, and D fall in the downbeats in the first measure, and B, G, E, and C fall in the downbeats in the second measure, which essentially makes it sound like I'm playing two different chords. And the reason that happens is the C major scale, or any major scale, has 7 notes. There's 8 eighth notes in a measure, so it's not symmetrical. So the notes that fall on the downbeat in the first octave you play the scale are not going to be the notes that fall on the downbeats in the second octave you play the scale. And in fact, my little diagram here of measure 1, you can see that it spells a D minor chord. C, A, F, and D fell in the downbeat. And then measure 2, I've got B, G, E, and C, which sounds like a C major 7. So I'm actually playing 2 chords instead of 1, and it doesn't have a lot of direction, and it doesn't sound like the kind of thing that jazz players play. In fact, if you just played a 2-octave descending major scale, you would not sound like a jazz player per se at all. However, if you added a half step between A and G in the C major scale, or a half step between the 5th and the 6th, then what you have is something that repeats itself in both octave and actually spells a chord, and is the kind of thing that jazz players play. So if we look at the notes that fall in the downbeats in this C major bebop scale, C, A, G, E, and then again C, A, G, and E. So both measure 1 and 2 spell the C major 6th chord. Now in major bebop scales, there's a lot of options, as we'll find, because we can spell major 6th chords or we can spell major 7th chords. But in the simplest way to establish the sound of actually sounding like a jazz player and getting into the sound of the chord, we can just add 1 half step to the major scales and spell the major 6th chord by using this half step between the 6th and the 5th. If, on the other hand, we're playing a dominant 7th chord, if we add a half step between the tonic and the flat 7, in this case a C7 bebop scale going C, B, B flat, so B natural is the enharmonic tone. That means The C7 chord is the 5 chord of the key of F, so it uses an F major scale. I'm adding the B natural. That's the note that's not in the F major scale. That's what makes it enharmonic. So when I go C, B, B flat, A, G, F, E, D, C, B, B, B flat, in both octaves, the notes that fall in the downbeat are C, B flat, E, and G and E. C, B flat, G, and E, or a C7 chord in both octaves. It's very important to know that jazz players play the C7 chord on G minor chords and G minor C7, a modal jam in G minor. I would use a C7 bebop scale. The G minor and C7 are largely interchangeable in the way people improvise melodies. In fact, Charlie Parker said that there are no dominant chords. There are no minor chords. There's only dominant and major chords. So, and that's largely true in terms of constructing bebop sounding solos. So, in lesson 3 and 4, we're going to analyze in depth, making more half steps in these scales and figuring out other things about these scales, like using them with arpeggios and coming down from notes other than the tonic. And so chapter 3, we're going to discuss the arpeggio loop, the 3 most commonly played arpeggios in a 2/5 situation, and then connecting them with bebop scales. And then in lesson 4, we're going to discuss coming down from all 7 notes of the key that we're in and half steps that need to be added to get into the sound of the chord. So hopefully you understand why we're using these scales, and if you want to sound like your favorite instrumentalist, chances are really good. You're going to need to understand bebop scales to do that. So I look forward to seeing you in lesson 3 and getting to work on dominant bebop scales. Thank you.